fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth from this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal.
Abraham Lincoln. Litigator, legislator, and emancipator. Or was it traitor, invader, and dictator? Today, April 14th, 1865, you get to decide. And later this month, they may put it to a vote in Washington to see if I'll become the first impeached president of the United States. Some of my critics claim that I'm two-faced. Well, let me ask you. If I had two faces, would I wear this one? Some of you may have heard the story of this knife. It was given to me many years ago by a fellow who merely walked up to me and said, "Here, this is for you." I said, "What's the occasion?" He explained it had been given to him many years before that, with the stipulation he had to keep that knife until he met someone homelier than himself. He said, "It's yours now, Abe, and now you must keep it until you meet someone homelier than yourself." Well, many years have passed. I've met a lot of people, but I still have that knife. Some say I'm like the farmer's scarecrow that was so ugly that the crows returned the corn they had stolen last year. My social skills weren't much better. When I met my first wife, Mary Todd, was at a dance. I walked up to her and I stammered out, "Well, Mary, I'd like to dance with you in the worst way." Later, she confessed to her friends that I did. Well, my social skills improved over the years, but I still didn't get any better looking. Oh, there was some improvement, some say, when I grew this beard. But, you know, it wasn't even my idea to grow it. A young lady from Springfield, Illinois, Miss Grace Goodell, shortly before the 1860 presidential election, she wrote me a letter. She said, "I have 4 brothers, Mr. Lincoln. I have convinced 2 of them to vote for you, but the other 2 say they won't vote for you you're too ugly to be president." But Mr. Lincoln, sir, if you just grow some chin whiskers, it might improve your appearance and your chances to get elected. Well, it turns out young Grace was right. I was elected, but I still have the knife. Many things have happened since I got that knife. Over the years, I've been a rail splitter, a farmer, a soldier. Back in 1832, there was some problem with the Black Hawk Indians. A few of us boys formed a militia to help deal with it. Boys elected me captain. I'm pretty proud of that. First time anybody ever elected me for anything, I must say, I liked it. Now, we never saw much action, just marching around from here to there, but as captain, I was in charge of hollering out the proper marching orders. Left face, right face, forward march. Well, things were running pretty smoothly until one day we came upon a problem. The boys were marching 4 abreast, see, and we come upon this narrow gate. And for the life of me, I could not remember the proper order to get them to form a single line and pass through one behind the other. So as they got closer, I said, "All right, men, pull out." And in 2 minutes, we're going to fall in again on the other side of that fence. I also spent some time on the river. I'll never forget how excited I was to make my first voyage down the Mississippi to visit New Orleans. But my excitement soon turned to shock when I came upon the first slave auction I had ever seen. I couldn't believe my eyes. Human beings being paraded around like animals, inspected like livestock. Why, those slave traders would separate entire families, separate brother from sister, husband from wife, even separated little children from their mothers. I never got over it. I said that day, if I ever got the chance to hit the institution of slavery, I was going to get hit it hard. Even though I only had 1 year of schooling, I studied up on my own and became a lawyer. The Honest Abe came in pretty handy in the courtroom. Once there was this fellow named Duff Armstrong. He was accused of murder. I was hired as his lawyer. Now, the only eyewitness against Duff said he saw the whole thing by the light of the moon. Well, I produced a copy of the Farmer's Almanac, which showed that on that night, there was no moon. So he couldn't have seen anything on that dark, moonless night. Not guilty, said the judge. Another time, an old man was being questioned on the witness stand by the judge. How old are you? Asked the judge. I'm 60 years old. Now, the court knows you to be older than 60. Oh, you must be including those 10 years I spent in Missouri. That was such a waste of time, I don't even count it. Well, eventually I became involved in politics. 1832, I ran for my very first election. And I lost. 1837, still in the political arena, I made a speech that turned out to be pretty memorable after many years. I spoke of the dangers facing our nation. At what point, then, is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reaches, it must spring up amongst us and not from abroad. As a nation of freemen, we must live through all time or die by suicide. Well, taking the momentum from that speech, I ran again in 1838 and lost. 1840, another election, another loss. I did not give up. 1843, ran for Congress and lost. 1848, I ran again. Now this time I ran against a preacher who invited me to one of his prayer meetings to hear him preach. From the pulpit, Preacher Cartwright said, the Bible tells us there has been only one perfect man to ever appear on the earth, and says nothing about a perfect woman. From the back, a woman's voice. I know that there has been a perfect woman. I know this because I have heard about her every day for the past 20 years. Who then is this perfect woman? My husband's first wife. Then he got his congregation all fired up. All those who wish to go to heaven, please rise. Everybody stood with me. All those who do not wish to go to hell, please rise. Again, I remained seated. Now Preacher Cartwright looked at me and said, it looks like everybody here except you, Mr. Lincoln, wish to go to heaven and do not wish to go to hell. May I ask you, Mr. Lincoln, where you wish to go, heaven or hell? I stood up and said, neither. Yet, I'm going to Congress, and I won. Congressman Abe Lincoln. Well, I wasn't very popular as a congressman, partially because I opposed the spread of slavery to the new territories to the west. But I really made enemies when I opposed President Polk in his involvement in the Mexican War. My speech before Congress, I said, the President has stated this war was started when Mexican troops shed American blood on American soil. I demand that the President show us the exact spot on the map where this occurred. He cannot, for he knows full well he sent American troops right into the middle of a Mexican settlement. And that's where the first blood of this war was shed. He is only seeking military glory, that attractive rainbow that rises in showers of blood. Another impressive speech. After that, I was promptly dismissed from Washington, sent home to Springfield, where I was branded as a traitor. But I ran in 1854 and lost. 1858, I ran for Senate again. Now, at this point in time, the country was being severely divided over this controversy of slavery, whether or not to allow it into the Western territories. Only now this controversy had a face. Folks, I'd like you to meet Mr. Dred Scott. Dred Scott was a Missouri slave whose master took him to the North Free States area to live for a time, and while there he sued for his freedom, tried to get his rights as a citizen, took his case all the way to the Supreme Court. The court rejected his case. According to Chief Justice Twain, the Supreme Court did not recognize Mr. Dred Scott as a citizen. Further, the Supreme Court of the United States did not even recognize Mr. Dred Scott as a human being. He was merely the property of his owner, like a cow or a horse. I couldn't abide by this. This was the backdrop to the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858. These debates were really something. It was like the circus was coming up. commander-in-chief. All this and run the country too. One of the things that took up my time was folks coming to seek government office jobs. Office seekers, we call them. There was no end to them. They covered me like ants. Why, even when they would hear about a current office holder passing away, they'd line up to take his job. Once I was accosted in the office by a fellow who heard about the death of a postmaster in his area. He grabbed me by the arm and said, "Mr. President, you just got to let me take his place." I said, "Well, it's fine with me, but I'll have to check with the undertaker first." But the war was the first priority. In those days, there were thousands of people who lived in the North and sympathized with the Southern cause. Many of these people lived in Baltimore. The fact is, after the election, when I was traveling from Springfield to Washington to take the oath of office, I had to be secreted through Baltimore because of those people in a train, slouched down without my top hat wrapped in a shawl so that I wouldn't be assassinated before I even took the oath. Now the war had broken out, these same men in Baltimore had attacked Union troops on their way to protect the capital. When I got this news, I knew drastic measures were called for. So I had them all arrested, held without trial. In other words, I suspended their constitutional right of habeas corpus. Since this was a constitutional matter, I wanted to meet with my cabinet before proceeding. Gentlemen, we are met here to discuss my plans to suspend habeas corpus. The Constitution allows this during times of rebellion, but I want to get your opinion. Please indicate your vote by saying yea or nay. What say you, Secretary of State Seward? Nay. And you, Secretary of War Stanton? Nay. Treasury Secretary Chase? Nay. Attorney General Bates? Nay. Postmaster General Blair? Nay. Secretary of the Navy, Mr. Wells? Nay. Secretary of the Interior, Mr. Smith? Nay. So it's nay, 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 nay. Well, gentlemen, the ayes have it. Gentlemen, these attackers are like mad dogs. It reminds me of the story about the fellow who was walking down this road with his pitchfork over his shoulder. Neighbor's mad dog comes out and attacks him. Well, he has no choice but to kill the dog with the pitchfork. Well, now the neighbor comes running out. "Why'd you kill my dog?" "Oh, why'd your dog attack me?" "Why didn't you just fend him off with the blunt end?" "Why didn't your dog attack me with his blunt end?" Everybody's hoping for a short war. 90 days was some of their opinions. My hopes were dashed along these lines when I saw my generals in action. And I mean inaction. McClellan was the worst. He didn't want to fight a war. What he really wanted was to be president. He proved that by running against me in 1864. Found out later his plan was to just have the armies march all over the country until they got tired and then negotiate with the South and then let them keep their own government. He was trying to ride two horses at the same time, one of war and one of peace. Couldn't get him to fight. All the while, he bragged about what a great military man he was. He was like the fellow who was going off to war and his wife knitted across the front of his shirt, "Victory or death." He looked at it and he said, "Ain't that a little strong? Couldn't you just say victory or be crippled?" No, I met with him in the battle lines at one point. He said, "Mr. President, we successfully engaged the enemy and then repositioned our forces 50 miles to the north." I said, "General, our objective lies to the south." But he wouldn't stop bragging. He reminded me of the fellow who owned this dog. Bragged on this dog all the time, how great a wolf hunter dog this was. All day long, my dog just hunts wolves. Well, his neighbors finally called his bluff, invited him on a wolf hunt. darkest of times. Sometimes that backfired. Once there were two women overheard on a train during the war. One of them said, "I think the South will win because Jeff Davis is a praying man." "Well, so is Abe Lincoln," replied her friend. "I know, but God will think Abe is joking." Back to my generals, one of them sent me telegrams from headquarters in the cell. I said, "That's your problem, General. You got your headquarters where your hindquarters should be." Once I telegraphed McClellan, "General, if you're not going to use your army, may I borrow it?" I finally had to fire him and replaced him with the real general. Had to go all the way to Ohio to find him. General Ulysses S. Grant. Now he could fight, not only fight, but win. Can't argue with success. Oh, there was some talk about him drinking too much whiskey. But whenever it come up, I would say, "Find out what brand of whiskey General Grant drinks and send a barrel of it to my other generals." No, we were finally making some progress. Not only with General Grant's victories, but also successful engagement by Senator General Meade, General Sherman, and General Sheridan. But not without great loss. In the end, 600,000 young men would die. I had to find a way to end the rebellion, but to cut short this terrible loss of life. I was getting plenty of advice. I was being criticized for backing away from my promise to free the slaves. I said, "I may walk slowly, but I never walk backwards." Then, the editor of the most popular newspaper in the country, Mr. Horace Greeley, published an article saying that I had no promise and that I had abandoned the slaves. So I had to respond to Mr. Greeley. What he didn't know was that I already had a draft of the Emancipation ready before I wrote him his letter. Dear Mr. Greeley, as to my policy, if I could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing none of the slaves, I would do it. If I could save the Union by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would do it. I have here stated my official policy, not to be confused with my oft-expressed opinion that all men everywhere be free. My responsibility was to save the Union. If all the slaves were free and there was no Union, where would the advantage be? I met with the cabinet when I felt the time was right. I was waiting for a military victory that would show Britain and France that their attempts to back the South were futile. It came in Antietam, and that's when I released the Emancipation Proclamation. However, this document is one of the most misunderstood documents in history. Some assume that it simply freed all the slaves, but that would be coming to the wrong conclusion. This was used under the War Power Act, which allowed me to confiscate enemy property. Now remember, all along the South was claiming that these slaves were property, and it was that property I was confiscating. This was a strategic military decision. It had nothing to do with my personal feelings about slavery. There were slave-holding states who were loyal to the Union, border states. I did not want them to leave the Union now. No slaves were freed in those areas because of the emancipation. Now, it was my idea that the South saw thousands of former slaves putting on Union uniforms. It would shock them into laying down their arms and cutting this rebellion short. Make no mistake, the emancipation shortened the Civil War. 1863, the Battle of Gettysburg was fought and won by Union General Meade. But again, thousands of young men lost their lives in only 2 days. I was invited there in the fall to give a speech as part of a dedication to a cemetery for all those fallen men.
he has a few words to say.
Fourscore, 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we're engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation, so conceived and so dedicated, might long endure. We're met on a great battlefield of that war. We've come here to dedicate a portion of it as a final resting place to those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It's altogether fitting and proper that we do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. Those brave men, living and dead, who fought here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add and detract. The world will little know nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us rather to live, be here dedicated to the unfinished work that those who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is for us rather to be here dedicated to the great task that lies before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion for that cause for which they gave their last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. Not only did I have to deal with the rising casualties, I now have to deal with a situation where young Union soldiers, out of fear, were running from the battle lines and now facing fire and squalor. I was always trying to find ways to pardon them. Sometimes it was all too easy. Dear Secretary of War Stanton, as to the As to the 14-year-old waiting to be shot, let us spank this 14-year-old drummer boy and send him home to his mother. Sincerely, A. Lincoln. As the war was drawn to a close, General Sherman finished his horrific and successful march to the sea. General Grant took Vicksburg, giving the Union full control of the Mississippi River, and then went on to defeat the Confederates at Chattanooga. And finally, Richmond fell, which forced General Lee to surrender his army to General Grant at Appomattox. General Lee said he surrendered more to Abe Lincoln's goodness than to General Grant's guns. I felt good about that. Now it was time for healing. It was also time for me to make my second inaugural speech. As tens of thousands stood in the mud of a rain-soaked Pennsylvania Avenue, I spoke in a tone of reconciliation rather than one of victory. Both parties deprecated war. One would accept war rather than let the nation live. The other would accept war rather than let it perish. Both parties pray to the same God and invoke His aid against the other. turned to the band and asked them to play one of my favorite songs, Dixie. True to my word, I ordered that the Confederate soldiers who had surrendered be allowed to return home with their mules and horses in time for spring planting, so that this year they could plant seed instead of men in southern soil. For my part, I was anxious to visit the fallen capital of the Confederacy, Richmond. And as my son Tad and I walked down the main avenue, some of those former slaves actually tried to kneel before me. Get up! No, you must not kneel before me. Kneel only to God and thank Him for the freedom you shall now enjoy. You see, now they were truly free. Not by the emancipation, which could have been declared null and void now that the war was over, but by the 13th Amendment, which when ratified would abolish slavery in this entire nation forever. I also wanted to visit the Confederate White House, as they called it. And on a whim, I sat in old Jeff Davis's chair. Even he was no enemy now. Well, that was 6 days ago, and they're still celebrating in the streets of Washington. I had promised my wife Mary I would take her out to enjoy an evening at the theater. Take a break from all this sad business. I said, we're going to make tonight the first of many nights to enjoy this new life. It's been a while since we went to the theater. Tonight we're going to see a play called Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater. About 2 years ago we went to a play called The Marble Heart with a wonderful young actor. What was his name? Booth! John Wilkes Booth. A wonderful performance. After the play, I sent a note backstage to see if I could meet with him. He declined. And no surprise, many people have come to hate me over these war years. Well, maybe that'll all change now. I hope that it will. Well, I better be getting off. Mary Todd is many things, but she's not a patient woman. It's funny, she's the only thing I'm afraid of that I know can't hurt me. But on the other hand, you folks have listened patiently to my story. Before I run off, maybe I can take a minute or so to answer any questions you might have about Abe Lincoln and the Civil War. We can bring up the house lights. I can maybe answer a couple questions. Anybody have any questions out there? Any questions? Yes?
How far back do people wear the genealogy know their ancestors?
Abe Lincoln's ancestors?
Abe Lincoln. Yeah, not yours. Abe Lincoln.
Well, my family came from Kentucky. That's where I was born. It was traced all the way back to England back in those days before they came from there. Kentucky went to Indiana, then to finally to Illinois, to Washington. Anyone else? No one else has a question.
You're pretty awesome.
One at the back there?
Yes, I think you're pretty awesome.
Well, thank you. I know at least half the country doesn't agree, though. I had 4 sons. One died before I was president. Willie died in the White House, so there's still Tad and Robert left. Anyone else? Yes?
Did Eddie follow politics?
Robert did. He was actually served in the presidential cabinet many years back. I read about this, I'm not for sure. Wasn't there. Yes?
How did you support yourself through all those lost elections?
Well, I was hoping to be an example to others and not to give up. And I guess that I really believed in some of the things that I was running for, and even though it about 20 years in Paulding. And when I left Springfield, when I came to Washington, I told my partner, Willie Herndon, not to take the sign down, Lincoln and Herndon, because I would be back. Anyone else? These are good questions. Yes?
It said when you married your first wife, is that a pun? Well, see, he only had one wife.
Yes, there were two marriages in my life. One where we had kind of a tumultuous relationship, and that ended without wedding. But I only had one wife, Mary Todd, who came from Kentucky as well, and her family was a slave-holding family. She lost two of her brothers in the fighting for the Confederacy, which caused some suspicion as far as her loyalty. Yes?
From what I've read about the Civil War, why did it take you so long to dispense with your inner generals?
Because I was not experienced in war. The one who was heading up the army was an old relic from the Mexican War. You may remember him. He was hard to even tell him what time of day it was, but finally he got it. But McClellan came highly recommended. As a matter of fact, he was a great organizer and had this huge army that was trained, but he wasn't doing as much with it. So it wasn't his lack of training ability, but it was his lack of fighting that I was opposed to. Yes?
How old was Abraham Lincoln when he left Kentucky? That's a log cabin.
I was not even a teenager when the log cabin days were over, but some of that reputation followed me. As a matter of fact, I ran as a rail splitter for many of my elections, well, the first one for president especially, but just a pre-teen is when the log cabin was up when we moved to Indiana.
Was that where your folks died?
I was raised by my father's second wife. We remained close until the day she died. I really had not much of a relationship with my father. Anyone else? Well, yes.
Did you ever find it exasperating with the Senate trying to get them to back you in all this?
The opposition from the Senate?
Yes.
No, I didn't find it exasperating. I knew what the right thing to do was, and I always said that once you find on to something like that, you hold on and you keep fighting. But as a matter of fact, I wouldn't have been a president if there wasn't so much division in the country. There was actually two presidential elections in 1860, one in the South and one in the North, the way it turned out, the way the parties were aligned. I didn't even appear on the ballot in any Southern states. So it was only because of that four-way split in the votes that I became president in the first place. So in some ways, I was glad there was that much division. Well, one more question I'll take, and then I've got to run off. Yes?
I'm just thinking, I was wondering, how important was God in the decision?
I always felt that God was praying was so important, especially when there was no other avenue. So I always felt that he was very important in guiding. Although I felt that when I talked about both sides invoking God's help against the other, I think that's something to think about even today, when both sides of a conflict who read the same Bible and pray to the same God would ask his aid in defeating the other one. So that's what I was about. Well, I must go. I'm a little uneasy tonight. I've been having these recurring dreams. Same dream over and over again. I wake up in the middle of the night and I hear all this crying in the White House. I walk out and I see a coffin in the entryway, and I ask, who died in the White House? And the answer is always the same. The president did come. So it's a little unnerving. But what really got me is this evening, at the end of each day, my White House bodyguard and I, we had sort of a ritual. We approach each other and salute, and I always say, good night, Mr. Crook. Only tonight we saluted and I said, goodbye.